And the reason I chose this cake is because it will show you really an interesting example of how the different flour that you use has a different outcome. But also I can talk about beating egg whites, which is what we did in our last session, and that has a lot of relevance to, well, it's texture of cake, certainly. Also, it was reported to me that cookies, rolled cookies, are very good with Wondra. I have not tried that yet. It's actually, with a chiffon cake, it's very good as far as flavor and texture, but the outside of it isn't as even. It has a kind of funny look to the crumb. And with a chiffon cake, you want to be able to present it and serve it looking beautiful, so there's a case where I wouldn't use it. But in my upcoming book, I'm giving Wondra as my first choice for all the genoise and all the sponge type of cakes, including the Wondra. That's how blown away I am by this. I think that's it about flour, unless, before I start doing the cake, if anybody has any questions about flour in general. Once I start mixing it, I can't stop too easily. Bill, and then...
Why are they outlawing bleaching of flour?
Oh, thanks for asking, because Bill just asked, why are they outlawing the bleaching of flour? And they seem to think that chlorine is dangerous. And I asked Tim Hubbard, General Mills, about this, and he said that our FDA approves it, and you know how stringent our FDA is, that they don't approve red food dye. I mean, no wonder poor Nancy had to use beets in her red velvet cake. You know. When I found out that they were taking it off the market, I immediately bought 20 bottles so I'd have the good stuff for the rest of my life. And believe me, I still have 19 of them. You know, you don't use it in that kind of quantity. So I actually got another article from the woman from Kate in England 2 days ago, from a Japanese scientist who wrote a paper about the heat treatment of flour and gelatinization and things like that. He works for Kobe Women's University. And so I asked him in my email to him, hoping he'd get back to us today, and he did, why they think that chlorine is so dangerous. And he sent me back an answer that admitted that they hadn't done certain types of studies and used a word that had something to do with metastasis, and that it didn't cause metastasis. I thought, in what? In the flour? In the, in the human body? His paper said that the chlorine, well, it's really interesting actually, let me back up, because he was saying that, and this is true, that the grain of the flour can bond when it's been treated, can bond to other things. When I was in Switzerland several years ago, we were in a flour factory where they were producing sourdough, dried sourdough starter. They coated the flour particles with a starter, they bound it to it, so that you could have a kind of instant sourdough starter. And I sort of put that in the back of my mind, stopped thinking about it, and then it came to America a few years ago, and I tried it. And you know, it's more for industry where you're interested in speed, but it turns out that you can bond flavors to the flour granule as well. So all sorts of things can bond, and their theory is that the chlorine will also bond, and it will be taken into the body, and it will do something there. See, I always thought chlorine dissipates. So this is something that hasn't been worked out 100%, but so far we don't seem to think it's unsafe. And I'm glad, because maybe heat-treated flour is a good answer, but I've never used it, and I love chlorine bleach, and everybody who is in the flour industry loves it, because what it does in a cake is it doesn't just enable it to gelatinize better, it also enables the butter to stay in suspension, because the way it's bonding with these different things, because it's roughened up, it's kind of like the flour particles are almost like ball bearings. They're so smooth, and if you use unbleached flour and you bake a cake with butter that has solid butter, not melted butter, what happens is it looks perfect, and then you take it out of the oven and you think, great, and 5 minutes later it is a hole in the center, it falls. And when you cut into it, the butter has actually dropped out of suspension because it isn't being bound to the flour granules during that gelatinization process. So that's why I don't like using unbleached flour in that type of cake baking, because it's a disappointment. And the amazing thing is, you know, with all food, when the texture is altered, the flavor is altered. So you can have all the same components and suddenly it tastes bitter because of the way in which it behaved. So that was a very nice question, and I wrote back to him thanking him for his generous response, but of course I learned exactly nothing from it other than that nobody really knows for sure yet, so stay tuned. But we do supply flour all over the world. I mean, flour from America is considered the best flour, and now we can't supply bleached flour to other countries. Am I not right, Christina? So there are many countries that will not yet. Yes?
I have several questions, but you can answer shortly. So the corn flour or
Cornstarch? Cornstarch.
doesn't have protein at all, or has really low amount of protein? Because it acts really funny, you know, when you add water to it. So it depends on the amount of water. It can be really, really hard, and then it becomes really, really.
Oh, I'm so glad. Did everybody hear that? You were saying that, is there protein in corn flour or cornstarch? Because it can become really hard, and then it can become completely loose again.
Yeah.
And that's it's a slightly complicated issue, but the quick explanation is that that's, again, gelatinization. The particles of cornstarch or flour, because you can make a sauce from flour too, when it reaches the boiling point, it's capable of swelling up. So each of these little granules are absorbing water gradually, and as they absorb water, they thicken, and the outside membrane gets thinner and thinner, and then they're all clumped together in a good way, so that's thick. But there are two things that can destroy it. One is agitation. If you stir, like when you're making lemon meringue, what happens is those fragile outer membranes that have been expanded are easy to burst. And so the water's in there, it all comes out. The other thing is that when you're baking or cooking or custard with egg yolk, and there's an enzyme called amylase in the egg yolk that doesn't get activated until it's 140 degrees. And I remember doing this book in the Cook in Philadelphia where I think I did a tiramisu, and I went into the kitchen and they were doing the recipe for me, and it was perfectly thickened, and the next day it was soup. And I said, what do you suppose could have happened? And it's a little hard to be a detective when you're not the one who did it. But I suddenly remembered about that enemy amylase. And I said, what temperature did you bring it to? And she said, I don't have a thermometer, but I think it was high enough. And I said, I think it couldn't have been, because otherwise that wouldn't have happened. Was that the only question you had?
I also wanted to ask about, so you said it's better to keep flour in the fridge or in the freezer?
In the freezer.
I
Keep flour.
usually do it, but then I got, you also said that it gets the water, so because it's better to dry, to hydrate.
Just saying if it's better to keep flour in the freezer, but it can get moisture from the freezer, that's why you have to store it airtight. You have to put it in those subsealed bags, maybe 2 bags, because it won't penetrate through the bag. I mean, the only thing that can penetrate is odor. Now that we're not allowed to have the right kind of plastic, that's become FDA disapproved. I used to love Saran Wrap, the original, because it kept odor and moisture out. But when they came out with a new press and seal, I called the head technologist there, and I said, can you tell me, because I'm really looking for something where you can store dairy stuff and chocolate, all these things are so susceptible to pulling other odors in. And they said, to be truthful, it's a total moisture barrier, but not a total odor barrier. And I said, how is that possible? And they said, the moisture molecules are larger. Yeah, there's so many things that don't meet the eye that you wonder about. But another interesting thing about freezing flour is that I wanted to make my own starter, and Billo is now about 5 years old and alive and being fed every week. I named my starter. I was very attached to it. But it's not easy to start a starter unless you use preferably rye flour, but that is organic, because the organic flour has not been sprayed, so that it has the natural bacteria on it that helps ferment and start yeast. It doesn't just come from the air. So for the first time, I brought in organic flour, and all of a sudden I saw in the corner of my eye something sort of moving on one of my bannetons. What do they call them? Not cooties. What are those critters that invade flour? Nobody's ever had that happen? Mealy. That's right. There was that movie about the guy in the ship, Captain Russell Crowe, who had some sort of joke about him. I didn't laugh because I had to clean out every flour I had. And I store flour sometimes for years, cake flour, so it was kind of heartbreaking because normally flour that's not whole wheat will not get mealybugs. But when you get it through something else, like the rye, it will go everywhere. And I even had to put my banneton in the oven to get it out of the burlap part and the wood. So,
It's another reason why you put it to freeze.
thank you, that was my point, because if you put it in the freezer for a few days, just as pork, the trichinosis will be killed in freezing, so will these critters. So, without changing the flour.